Hello everybody, we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1964. Who's going to win this election? Let's find that out right now. Now, as always, we're going to start off with the incumbent party, and that is the Democrats. John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, he is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. So this leaves his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, to take the reins of the presidency. And by the time 1964 rolls around, his nomination for a full term was pretty much in the bag. But he wanted to control the convention and to avoid a public fight over civil rights, which was becoming a big issue by the time the 60s rolled around. Now, he did face a challenge from the governor of Alabama, a famous segregationist, George Wallace. He ran in a number of northern primaries in the north against Johnson, and he did surprisingly well in Maryland, Indiana, and Wisconsin. But at the end of the day, it is going to be Johnson who receives the Democratic nomination for president, and he's going to bring along for the ride a liberal and civil rights activist, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, as his running mate. Now that we have our Democratic ticket of LBJ and Hubert Humphrey, LBJ running for a full term, let's go to the Republicans. Now, when 1964 rolls around, the Republicans are badly divided between its conservative and moderate liberal factions. Former Vice President Richard Nixon, who was a moderate, who was beaten in 1960 by Johnson's predecessor, JFK, decides not to run for president in 1964. Nixon was a moderate that had ties to both wings of the party, and he was able to unite the party in 1960. But with him not running in 64, the Republican Party divides into the moderate liberal faction and the conservative faction. But we have a list of candidates putting themselves up for nomination wide open. Those candidates are Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, the Governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. of Massachusetts, who was the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans in 1960. The Governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, Congressman Walter Judd of Minnesota, Hiram Fong, Senator from Hawaii, Minnesota's Harold Stassen, and Congressman John W. Burns of Wisconsin. But at the end of the day, it is going to be Goldwater, who was the leader of the conservative wing of the Republican Party, who receives the Republican nomination for president, and is going to bring along for the ride William E. Miller, congressman from New York, as his running mates. Now that we have our Democratic ticket of LBJ and Hubert Humphrey and our Republican ticket of Goldwater and Miller, let's put these guys into the ring and see who comes out with the W. Although Goldwater had been successful in rallying conservatives, he was unable to broaden his base of support for the general election. Shortly before the Republican convention, he had alienated most moderate Republicans by his votes against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is one of the biggest civil rights pieces of civil rights legislation, not only in American history, but also since Reconstruction, which Johnson championed in signing the law. Goldwater's campaign manager, Denison Kitchell, a Phoenix lawyer and friend of nearly 3 decades, wrote Goldwater's speech explaining his opposition to the legislation. The Johnson camp used to vote against the legislation to paint Goldwater as a racist, even though Goldwater supported the civil rights cause in general and voted in favor of the 1957 and 1960 Civil Rights Acts. Goldwater considered desegregation a matter for the individual states rather than a national policy. Goldwater was famous for speaking, quote, off the cuff at times, and many of his former statements were given wide publicity by the Democrats. In the early 1960s, Goldwater had called the Eisenhower administration, quote, a dime-store New Deal, and the former president never fully forgave him or offered him his full support in the election. In December of 1961, he told a news conference that, quote, sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea, a remark which indicated his dislike of the liberal economic and social policies that were often associated with that part of the nation. That comment came back to haunt him in the form of a Johnson television commercial, as did remarks about making Social Security voluntary and selling the Tennessee Valley Authority. In its most famous verbal gaffe, Goldwater once joked that the U.S. military should, quote, lob one, a nuclear bomb, into the men's room of the Kremlin in the Soviet Union. Now, Goldwater was also hurt by the reluctance of many prominent moderate Republicans to support him. Governors Nelson Rockefeller of New York and George Romney of Michigan refused to endorse Goldwater and did not campaign for him. On the other hand, Nixon and Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton loyally supported the GOP ticket and campaigned for Goldwater, although Nixon did not entirely agree with Goldwater's political stances and said that it would be a tragedy if Goldwater's platform were not, quote, challenged and repudiated by the Republicans. The New York Herald Tribune, a voice for Eastern Republicans, supported Johnson in the general election. Some moderates even formed a Republicans for Johnson organization, although most prominent GOP politicians avoided being associated with it. Shortly before the Republican convention, CBS reporter Daniel Schorr wrote from Germany that, quote, it looks as though Senator Goldwater, if nominated, will be starting his campaign here in Bavaria, center of Germany's right wing, and, quote, Hitler's stomping ground, and finding that Goldwater would be speaking to a gathering, quote, right-wing Germans, uniting the extremists in both countries. In fact, there was no such meeting nor trip actually planned. Now, Fact Magazine published an article polling psychiatrists around the country as to Goldwater's sanity. Some 1,189 psychiatrists appeared to agree that Goldwater was emotionally unstable and unfit for the office, though none of the members had actually interviewed him. The article received heavy publicity and resulted in a charge to the ethics guidelines of the American Psychiatric Association. In a libel suit, a federal court awarded Goldwater $1 in compensatory damages and $75,000 in punitive damages. Now, Eisenhower's strong backing could have been an asset to the Goldwater campaign, but instead, its absence was clearly noticed. When questioned about the presidential capabilities of the former president's younger brother, University Administrator Milton S. Eisenhower, in July of '64, Goldwater replied, quote, one Eisenhower in a generation is enough. However, Eisenhower did not openly repudiate Goldwater and made one television commercial for Goldwater's campaign. A prominent Hollywood celebrity who vigorously supported Goldwater was Ronald Reagan. Keep that name in the back of your mind. Reagan gave a well-received televised speech supporting Goldwater. It was so popular that Goldwater's advisors had it played on local television stations around the nation. Many historians consider the speech a time for choosing to mark the beginning of Reagan's transformation from an actor to a political leader. And 2 years later, Reagan would become the governor of California. Now, Johnson positioned himself as a moderate and succeeded in portraying Goldwater as an extremist. Goldwater had a habit of making blunt statements about war, nuclear weapons, and economics that could be turned against him. Most famously, the Johnson campaign broadcasted a television commercial on September the 7th, dubbed the Daisy Girl ad, which featured a little girl picking petals from a daisy in a field, counting the petals, which then segs into a notched countdown and a nuclear explosion. Now, the ads are in response to Goldwater's advocacy of tactical nuclear weapons use in Vietnam. Confessions of a Republican, another Johnson ad, features a monologue for a man who tells us he had previously voted for Eisenhower and Nixon, but now worries about the men with strange ideas, weird groups, and the head of the Ku Klux Klan who are supporting Goldwater. He concludes that either they're not Republicans or I'm not. Voters increasingly view Goldwater as a right-wing fringe candidate. His slogan, "In your heart, you know he's right," was successfully parodied by the Johnson campaign into "In your guts, you know he's nuts," or "In your heart, you know he might," as an he might push the nuclear button, or even in your heart, he's too far right. Some cynics roll war buttons saying even Johnson is better than Goldwater. Now, the Johnson campaign's greatest concern may have been voter complacency, leading to low turnout in key states. To counter this, all of Johnson's broadcast ads concluded with the line, "Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd, which was the date of this election. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." The Democratic campaign used two other slogans, "All the Way with LBJ" and "LBJ for the USA." Now, the election campaign was disrupted for a week by the death of former President Herbert Hoover on the 20th of October, 1964. Because it was considered disrespectful to be campaigning during a time of mourning. Hoover died of natural causes. Remember, Hoover was president from 1929 to 1933, won election in 1928, then lost re-election in 1932. And both major candidates end up attending his funeral. And now that we have the campaign over, let's go to the results. This is going to be a landslide win for the Democratic Party. Lyndon B. Johnson and the Democrats are going to win this election, win a full term with 486 electoral votes. Barry Goldwater and the Republicans only get 52 electoral votes. 44 states and Washington, D.C. vote for LBJ and the Democrats. This is the first election in which Washington, D.C. was able to vote in a presidential election. It is not a state. But the 23rd Amendment, which was passed and ratified, says that Washington, D.C. has the right to vote in a presidential election. And Washington, D.C. has never given their electoral votes to a Republican. Now, Arizona, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, they are going to go to Barry Goldwater and the Republicans. And especially with these 5 southern states that Goldwater has carried in this election, this begins to show the transition of the South from a solidly Democratic region to a more conservative region, to a more Republican region. As you can see now with the Civil Rights Movement, the ideologies of the parties basically flip. The Democrats become more liberal, the Republicans become more conservative. So, and it shows that in the southern states that Goldwater carried. But Johnson would carry Texas, he would carry Arkansas, he would carry Tennessee and Virginia, North Carolina and Florida on his way to a landslide win for a full term. Now, in terms of the popular vote, it's going to be 61.1% for Johnson and the Democrats, and 38.5% for Goldwater and the Republicans. This is the highest won by a candidate since 1820. This is the 6th most lopsided presidential election in U.S. history in terms of electoral votes. And no candidate for president since has equaled or surpassed Johnson's percentage of the popular vote. And only Richard Nixon in 1972 and Ronald Reagan in 1984 have won by a greater electoral vote margin. 1972 will be coming up tomorrow, and 1984 will be coming up on Thursday. Now, we don't talk about consequences that often in the presidential election, but there is going to be some consequences that came out of this. Although Goldwater was defeated in a mega landslide, some political pundits and historians believed he had laid the foundation for the conservative revolution to follow. Ronald Reagan's speech on Goldwater's behalf, grassroots organization, and the conservative takeover of the Republican Party, although it was temporary in the 60s, would all help to bring about the Reagan Revolution of the 80s. Indeed, many of today's leading politicians first entered politics to work for Goldwater, including the presumptive Democratic nominee for this year's election, Hillary Clinton. She was a Goldwater girl. Johnson went from his victory in the 1964 election to launch the Great Society at home, signing the Voting Rights Act of '65 and starting the war on poverty. He also escalated the Vietnam War, which eroded his popularity. So by 1968, LBJ's popularity had declined, and the Democrats became so split over his candidacy that he had to withdraw, which we'll talk about that next time. Moreover, his support of civil rights for African Americans helped split white Union members and Southerners away from FDR's Democratic New Deal coalition, which would later lead to the phenomenon of the Reagan Democrat. Of the 12 presidential elections that followed up to 2012, which we'll talk about on Friday, Democrats would win only 5 times. The election also furthered the shift of the African American voting electorate away from the Republican Party, a phenomenon which had begun with the New Deal. Since the '64 election, Democratic presidential candidates have almost consistently won at least 80 to 90% of the African American vote in each presidential election, and no post-1964 Democratic presidential candidates has been able to match or better Johnson's performance in the Electoral College. Now, that fragmented split of the Democratic Party, we'll talk about that in the election in 1968 next time. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got a lot out of it. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. Have a good day, and we will see you next time at the election of 1968.